Przed Państwem wystąpi teraz Donald Lehn, który przyjechał z Madrytu, z Hiszpanii i reprezentuje cyrk, jest dyrektorem szkoły Campara w Madrycie oraz reprezentuje Carampa, oczywiście, że Carampa, reprezentuje Federację FEDEK.
Thank you. Good morning. Dzień dobry. Okay. Dzień dobry. Okay. So I was asked to talk this morning about circus in urban spaces. Hang on, let me just get my timer on, because if not, I'll spend the whole morning talking. Just to have a reference of how much we've been talking about. Circus in urban spaces, circus as a street art. So first, I ask you for 5 minutes just to situate circus in the streets as its natural space. What we call circus today has is only 230 years old. Long before it existed as circus, was an outdoor entertainment form, art form, whose natural space was the streets. It needs streets. It has to have a concentration of population in order to call its audience. So it's a form which has always been an outdoor form. It's a millenary form. It's been around for thousands of years, and it is only in the last 200 years that it has moved indoors. So it is more natural for the circus to be in the streets than for it to be in a theater. The first circus tent, after very long intellectual discussions, was placed around 1825. So even the circus in tents is a very, very recent venue for circus to take place. Before that, circus had permanent, well, not permanent, semi-permanent circus buildings before the tent in some large cities, but mostly it was a form that took place outdoors with bleachers surrounded by a canvas, by a big piece of cloth, or more frequently with nothing. The anomaly is not talking about circus in the street. The anomaly is talking about circus indoors. Shall we try and define circus? A scenic art or popular entertainment, and I make a distinction between the two, between art form and popular entertainment form, based on acrobatic techniques, balance, strength, and skill, historically accompanied by taming animals. And these skills are presented in a dramatic way, sometimes with a very simple dramatic discourse, sometimes with a more complex dramatic discourse, and not just as sports or achievements. And today, obviously, in the current evolution of circus, as a means of theatrical expression or as a scenic language. When we talk about the past of circus, and this is why I consider it important to reference it as a street art, in all cultures around the world, I think we can say on all continents, circus has presence and has presence as a scenic art form. So the Chinese troops, this is a more contemporary image. If you can see all the different apparatus, and if I move the mouse around, do you see it? Yeah, you follow that? So you can see the aerial apparatus were apparatus that could be fairly simply constructed outside. Obviously, wire walking was originally done between buildings, between trees. The balancing here is done on a table. He holds on his feet bamboo. Hanging from the bamboo are people. So originally, what today we hang from very complex rigging structures inside circus tents, there were solutions which were practical and simple in their own way that were used in order to present this. Circus in China existed and included many complex aerial apparatus. Also, many of the juggling forms that we know today as juggling forms were skill development exercises used by soldiers. The devil stick was used by swordsmen as a way to practice agility with their wrists. In India, along with taming bears and snakes, juggling balls was developed along with other balancing skills. Throughout Asia, contortion was both a part of circus. Actually, circus didn't exist, and it was even considered more so a part of dance. Interesting anecdote about juggling. So juggling in Europe, most European countries, jongleur, giocoliere, juggler, is a term that comes from a Latin origin. But in Spain, a juggler is called a malabarista. So a little personal curiosity, I wanted to know where the term malabarista came from. In India, there's the Costa Malabar, the southern coast of India, the southwestern coast of India is called the Costa Malabar. And as many circus skills had references to castes, to families of, on the margins of society, I thought perhaps the juggling was associated with that caste. But the first thought was, just as we call gypsies in Europe, gypsies, which is a false name that comes from Egypt, even though they really came from India, I thought perhaps in Spain they called jugglers malabaristas because they're people who came from India, and the boats came from Portugal, right? Portugal was the colony in Malabar, and say somebody who comes from the Costa Malabar, who comes to Europe and juggles. But I was in Sri Lanka a few years ago, after the tsunami, and in Sri Lanka as well, the word for juggler is malabarista. So it isn't a European misnomer, it's a name that actually is used in the area to describe malabaristas. So the conclusion is that perhaps, at least in India, the origin of the juggling caste is in Tamil, is actually from that area of India. The Romans trained their soldiers with juggling and other feats of strength. They balanced and spun chariot wheels. There are images of these things. And circus skills were also part of the big extravaganzas that they had in the arenas. We were talking about simple solutions for outdoor structures. Well, there's nothing simpler than this, okay? You can actually do a aerial duo with just a big guy, just an armario, we call them, a big closet on the bottom. American Indians have clown and jugglers as a part of their traditions, acrobats. They used to do races and juggle while running. The Indians from Mexico had stilt walking and other, they called maroma, wire and rope walking as a part of their culture. And in Europe, of course, in the Dark Ages, what are historically, culturally called the Dark Ages, the only form that flourished as a scenic art was street performing. Let me just run through a few more of these pictures. This is Indian jugglers. Also, you see here the simple use of a table as a platform. Even in the works of Bruegel, there are wire walkers, there are contortionists, there are acrobats, there are jugglers. So it's as a street form, as a presence in the marketplace, circus's first natural space was outdoors. Even in the second evolution, when we get to Italy and the Commedia dell'arte, which is perhaps the step between what should we call, a poor street form and a more respected form, they worked on high stages set up in the plaza and the center of Venezia. I just want to go back to one more image, and my time is running out already. This is an illustration from a pyramid in Egypt. So we see that this is a 2,000, 3,000 year art form. The interpretation of this series of images in the pyramid is that they are activities that took place at a wedding. So already almost 3,000 years ago, a juggler was somebody who was contracted to perform at a wedding. Okay? So if by then it was already a formal, recognized entertainment form, imagine what the real history of juggling must be long before that. In the 21st century, today, we are rediscovering the street as a place to do circus, and what is more worrisome, we are rediscovering the freedom to use it as on the street in the contemporary world. That's a privilege that we had lost. where does contemporary street performing come from? I sort of place the origin of this new evolution of circus in the hippie movement. So I consider myself a part of that period. This was the rebirth of juggling, when young people started going back out onto the streets, San Francisco in the 60s. And that was when the new generation of street performers, and I say new generation because these were the first generation of circus performers who did not necessarily have their origins in circus families. So new people with new approaches, defending new artistic means, which brought other theater influences, which brought dance influences, which brought politics, bread and puppet with their huge political parades, the San Francisco mime troupe. So all of these initiatives were born at the end of the 60s. So we're talking about a form today which has really just had this new development in the last 50 years. Today I talk about street performing on 3 different levels. First is just your regular street performer, okay? Somebody goes out and passes the hat. He finds a public thoroughfare with lots of movement. He looks for a place to set up, maybe a wider space, maybe something with a wall behind him, maybe a place with good acoustics. Calls his audience, he uses his skills to call his audience, and passes the hat. So that's today's street performer. The second stage would be a programming, somebody who is hired to perform in the streets for the fiestas, for a public event. A clown is called in on a Saturday afternoon to perform in a park for children. And larger events, such as this festival, in which many artists are called in to perform. At the larger events, there is an evolution. Beyond this simple street performer, who, from what I understand, is present in this festival, there are other ways of approaching performing, or circus performing, or clown performing in the streets. One of them is what I call character animation, in which somebody just walks around with a character. I think there's a French guy who has a baby carriage, in which he is inside the baby carriage. So you have this autonomous baby carriages driving up and down the street and relating to people. So he's not exactly calling an audience, but more relating to people in a natural way, or a contortionist who finds a phone booth and uses that phone booth to create an interesting theatrical moment. And then there are larger events such as the Olympics, such as some of the big festivals which bring in macro street festivals such as Generic Vapor, which works with a huge figure made out of 20 shipping containers with metal doors up above, and they were able to hang trapeze and do actions within the different things. So circus performing works on many different levels, many different scales. But, and this is really what I wanted to talk about, showing up and doing a show on the street is interesting. Obviously, our first commitment is to communicate emotions to our audience. But isn't there also a second level, which is relating to the spaces, relating to the urban space in which we perform? So first thing you do is look for a space, I can perform here. But perhaps there's a second step in which you look for a place where, if I hang my trapeze here, that would be really pretty, it would be really beautiful. All of a sudden you place yourself in a context in which, aside from just doing your show, you are interacting with the space that you choose. And let me just show you a performer here in New Orleans, if I can find him. This is Sri Lanka. Further along. Okay, I didn't run through these, but you can see here we begin to see the relationship between the image of the circus performance and the space where it takes place. So here we see a circus performer in medieval clothes, a jester-like costume. This is New Orleans in the late 70s. And what's interesting about it is seeing a jester juggling in a space like this here in Europe is really not unusual. But at that time in the United States, a jester was a character who was just known through storybooks, maybe through a movie. This performer found the space in front of a Spanish building, which in Europe is fairly natural, but in the United States, the architecture is unusual. And perhaps his reflection was beyond just, here's a nice place to do my show, here is a place where, by putting this jester costume in front of a 14th century, an old European style building, perhaps we transport our audience a little bit. We take them out of the United States context. In the United States, it's a country which has very little historical reflection. It's a country that was capable of tearing down the Metropolitan Opera House in Madrid, which would never happen. This was a lovely old theater. Before tearing it down, they look at the possibility of restoring it, and they have restored it. In the United States, that doesn't happen as much. So trying to give an audience the capability, even a street audience, of having a historical look at the place. So we talk about the show, which is the text, and the place, which is the context. And so developing a relationship between the performer and the context is a second step in integrating street performing into an, into an urban environment. I know about the reflection of this performer, because if you're capable of translating that face onto this body, that was me about 30 odd years ago, okay? I talked about finding an interesting space to hang a trapeze. Here a flying trapeze is placed in contrast with a very contemporary architecture. The reflection of the trapeze, broken up into little squares as the sun hits them and is reflected in the building, is another interesting way of provoking that contrast. I have a question. So we are at a circus festival. Hopefully among those of you who are listening, there are people who organize events and program. So a performer comes up to you and says, I would like to do a show using some of the buildings here in the city. It is technically very, very complicated. To put it together is very expensive. I'm going to do it at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it will probably be seen by 100 or 200 people. Would you hire it? Okay. When Philippe Petit did his walk in the United States between the Twin Towers, that's exactly what he did. The Twin Towers were not loved by New Yorkers. For the New Yorkers, the Empire State Building was real, and these were the new rich kids on the block, okay? He went in when the buildings were not quite finished. When he developed his action, the buildings were not quite finished. He was able to put on workers' clothes and go up and down with apparatus, and set up. The action that he performed, here you can see it in there was another little detail. You almost can't see it, okay? What happened here? No, not him, okay. There's other interesting circus spaces. From the bottom, so this is seen from the roof. You can imagine how big he must have been from the street. So the city didn't like it, but after he did this, as I say, expensive, 200 people, 7 in the morning, barely even photographed, the attitude of New Yorkers changed toward the Twin Towers. They were humanized. All of a sudden they had a reason to love these buildings, and they accepted them as a part of their city landscape. So I asked the programmer again, if somebody were to come to you with this proposal, expensive, difficult, complicated, dangerous, and all that, you would probably say no, but think about the effect that it had on a city of 8 million people, and it changed their way of looking at an essential part of their landscape. So we have to have a vision which goes beyond these technical complications and which goes beyond the simple concerns of audience, and imagine what these actions, which are intimately related to our urban spaces, can do to affect the way we ourselves perceive our environment. Just one last question. What do we have to do as schools, what do we have to do as educators in order to enable our students or future artists to be able to confront this kind of question, to be able to ask themselves, how can I be equipped, have the tools to be able to confront this? So beyond a quality technical education, it is important that our students have access to investigating processes. They have to know how to lock themselves up in a room and play with new ideas and find and generate a vocabulary in order to create newness, in order to take a challenge, an urban space, and be able to develop ideas to particularly be used in that urban space. Once they have this vocabulary, they have to confront a creative process. They have to use that vocabulary to write a poem. And finally, they have to have the capability to execute it, to be able to produce and budget and resolve technically the logistical problems of that execution. So today, when we talk about education, our challenge is to equip our students, to equip our future artists with these tools which allow them, beyond doing a handstand, to be able to confront new and exciting situations. Should we teach them how to do that? Should we tell them what to say? No. We should give them the tools and let them confront these challenges and surprise us. Thank you. Angry birds.